The vast expanse of the Dawson Ranch stretched under a sky the color of faded denim, broken only by the sharp, etched silhouettes of distant mountains. Rhett, perched on the top rail of the corral fence, watched a year-old colt test its strength against a sturdy post, a mirror of his own restless spirit. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sun, catching the glint of his spurs. He savored the quiet, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of hooves and the sigh of the wind through the tall prairie grass. It was a peace he'd cultivated fiercely over the years, a shield against the world's clamor and its insistent demands. A cloud of dust on the horizon heralded the approach of a buggy, its bright paint a jarring splash of color against the muted landscape. Rhett's jaw tightened. He recognized the rig and the determined set of Mrs. Gable's shoulders behind the reins. Another well-meaning but utterly misguided attempt at matchmaking. He swore under his breath. "Rhett Dawson, you busy man, you." Mrs. Gable's voice, a surprisingly robust instrument for her slight frame, cut through the quiet. She pulled the buggy to a halt, a plume of dust settling around them. "I brought you some of my rhubarb pie, and a proposition." Rhett swung his leg over the fence, landing with a soft thud. He offered a tight, polite smile. "Mrs. Gable, always a pleasure. Pie sounds good. The proposition, however, I suspect I already know." She beamed, oblivious to his thinly veiled resistance. "It's about Madeline Shaw. Such a lovely girl, Rhett. Intelligent, refined, and her family, well, they're going through a bit of a rough patch. A good, strong man like you, with a spread like this?" She gestured expansively, encompassing the miles of rolling prairie. "You'd be doing her a kindness, and yourself a favor. She's not looking for love, not in the way these young girls do. She's looking for security, a home." The word security hit Rhett like a stone. It echoed an old, bitter memory. "Mrs. Gable, with all due respect, I'm not in the market for a wife, especially not one who sees my ranch as a means to an end." His gaze was flinty, his voice low. "Tell Miss Shaw to look elsewhere. My home isn't for sale, and neither am I." He took the pie, its sweet scent incongruous with the sour taste in his mouth. "Thank you for the pie, though." Mrs. Gable, taken aback by his abruptness, stammered, "But Rhett, you misunderstand. She's a lady of quality, despite their recent setbacks. Her father—" "I understand perfectly," Rhett interrupted, his patience worn thin. "Good day, Mrs. Gable." He turned his back, effectively dismissing her, and walked toward the barn, the rhubarb pie a heavy weight in his hand. Miles away, in a drawing room that had seen better days, Madeline Shaw sat opposite her father, the silence between them thick with unspoken anxieties. The faded floral wallpaper and worn velvet of the settee were a stark contrast to the grand visions her mother still held for their family. Madeline, however, saw the truth in the fraying edges of the rug and the increasingly frequent visits from bill collectors. Her father, a man whose pride was as brittle as old parchment, wrung his hands. "Madeline, my dear, you must understand," he began, his voice reedy. "Mrs. Gable had the best intentions. A match with Rhett Dawson. It would solve all our problems." Madeline's spine stiffened. She'd overheard Mrs. Gable's report from the hallway, the sting of Rhett's dismissive words a fresh wound. "Father, I am aware of Mrs. Gable's intentions, and Mr. Dawson's, it seems." Her voice was quiet, but held an edge. He made it quite clear that he believes I am a fortune hunter, a woman seeking security. He did not even deign to meet me. Her father shifted uncomfortably. Well, he's a difficult man, Rhett Dawson, a loner. But he's got land, Madeline. More land than any 3 men combined. And no heirs. He's nearing 40. He'll settle down eventually. Madeline rose, walking to the window, her gaze lost in the dusty street outside. The afternoon sun cast long shadows, mirroring the gloom in her heart. He's a man who has clearly built walls around himself, Father. And he has no interest in letting anyone tear them down, least of all a woman he perceives as opportunistic. Her words, though calm, betrayed a deeper hurt. It wasn't just Rhett's dismissal, but the truth beneath it, that her family's desperate situation did make her vulnerable, did make her seem like a schemer. The thought chafed, igniting a quiet defiance within her. She was not a charity case, nor was she a gold digger. She was simply a woman trying to navigate a world that seemed determined to crush her family. Back at the ranch, Rhett sat on his porch, the untouched rhubarb pie cooling beside him. The last rays of sunlight bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The memory of his last entanglement, a woman who had seen his ranch as merely a stepping stone to a grander life in the city, festered like an old wound. She had been beautiful, charming, and utterly mercenary. It had taken him years to rebuild his trust, to mend the cracks in his pride. He'd sworn then to never again open himself to such a betrayal. Madeline Shaw, he thought, was just another version of the same story. A pretty face, a struggling family, and a desperate need for a man to provide. He'd seen it countless times. He wasn't a fool to be snared by a carefully constructed facade of refinement. His ranch, his livelihood, his very identity were too precious to risk on another woman's calculated ambitions. He'd worked too hard, fought too many battles to build this empire from nothing. He would not allow it to be diminished by a woman seeking to exploit it. He would remain alone, fiercely independent, and safe behind the impenetrable walls he'd painstakingly constructed around his heart. The pie, once a tempting offer, now lay forgotten, a symbol of the very thing he sought to avoid. A father's desperate bargain. The dim study reeked of stale pipe smoke and Mr. Shaw's familiar late-night dread. Opposite him, Silas Thorne, a man whose presence seemed to consume all available space, smirked, idly turning a heavy gold signet ring. Firelight flickered, momentarily softening the hard angles of Thorne's face, yet nothing could truly mask the predatory gleam in his eyes. "The terms are straightforward, Shaw," Thorne's voice rumbled. "Your ledger's cleared, every last farthing. In exchange, your daughter becomes my wife." He leaned forward, his imposing frame threatening to overwhelm the delicate mahogany desk. "A reasonable trade, wouldn't you agree? Especially given the precarious state of your current affairs." Mr. Shaw's hands, usually so steady navigating botanical texts, trembled as he clutched a half-empty glass of amber liquid. He swallowed, the burning drink doing little to untie the knot of fear in his gut. Madeline, vibrant and full of spirit, her laughter like wind chimes, the image of her light extinguished under Thorne's hand was pure agony. Yet the alternative, ruin, destitution, the complete collapse of the Shaw name, felt equally unavoidable. She is not a commodity, Thorne." His words were a fragile protest, a mere whisper against the man's unyielding will. Thorne chuckled, a dry, joyless sound. Everything has a price, Shaw. And your family's pride, it seems, is rather steep. Besides, consider it a rescue. The girl requires security, does she not? A proper home? I can provide that. His gaze, chillingly possessive, already laid claim. In the hallway, a floorboard groaned under Madeline's slipper. Unable to sleep, she'd been drawn by the low murmur of voices, a habit born of her father's increasingly frequent, clandestine meetings. The study door, ajar, bled a sliver of light into the darkness. She caught her father's strange tone, then Thorne's deeper, more commanding voice. A fair exchange, Thorne had stated. Your daughter becomes my wife. Madeline froze, a cold dread seeping into her bones, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pressed closer, straining to hear, her breath catching. She does not know of this, her father stammered, his voice thick with a mix of shame and desperation. Naturally, Thorne replied, a note of triumph in his voice. A pleasant surprise for her, wouldn't you agree? A solution to all her family's woes. She'll come to appreciate my generosity. An unmistakable undercurrent of menace laced his words. Madeline's mind reeled, piecing together fragments. Overheard conversations, hushed whispers from the servants, her father's increasingly gaunt face, the creditors, the mounting debts, the failed attempts at loans, and now this. Her stomach churned with a sickening lurch. She wasn't merely being proposed to, she was being sold. A chattel, an asset bartered to clear her father's ledgers. The shame burned hotter than any hearth fire. She recalled Rhett Dawson's dismissive glare, his quick judgment of her as a fortune hunter. The bitter irony twisted in her gut. He had been so wrong, profoundly so, but now she was to be reduced to something far worse than an opportunistic bride. She was to be a sacrificial lamb. A cold wave of terror washed over her. Silas Thorne. His reputation preceded him like a foul odor, a man of crude appetites and iron will, known for breaking spirits as easily as horses. The thought of his touch, his possessive gaze, sent shivers of revulsion down her spine. Her future, once a nebulous landscape of hope and uncertainty, had abruptly narrowed into a suffocating cage. She backed away silently, her bare feet making no sound on the polished wood. Each step felt heavy, as if she waded through thick mud. The stark, brutal reality settled upon her with the weight of a tombstone. She was trapped. Her father, in his desperate attempt to save their name, had unwittingly condemned her. The familiar air of the house now felt stifling, tainted by the stench of a terrible bargain. She had to escape. The thought solidified, a tiny flicker of defiance against the encroaching darkness. She would not be Thorne's property. She would not be bought and sold. No other place to run. The mahogany wardrobe, once a symbol of her mother's elegant life, now felt like a tomb. Madeline's hands, usually so steady with embroidery floss, trembled as she selected only the most practical garments. A sturdy woolen skirt, a plain cotton blouse, her warmest shawl, each item chosen not for beauty, but for survival. Her heart ached with each fold, a silent farewell to a life that had never truly been hers, a life built on an illusion of comfort and security that had shattered with Mr. Thorne's chilling demands. The small leather satchel, a gift from her father on her 10th birthday, offered scant room. A silver locket, a faded photograph of her mother, and the paltry sum of coins she'd saved from occasional errands. These were the only treasures she allowed herself. Each placement was a cut, severing a tie to the past she was fleeing. She glanced at the empty space on her finger where her grandmother's ring should have been, pawned months ago to keep the household running. The irony was a bitter taste in her mouth. She was to be sold, yet possess nothing of value to take with her. The house, usually alive with the soft clatter of the housekeeper or the murmur of her father's voice, was eerily silent. A heavy quiet had descended after Mr. Shaw's hushed conversation with Thorne, a silence that screamed of betrayal and despair. Madeline knew better than to wait. Thorne was not a patient man, and her father, broken and desperate, would offer no resistance. Her escape needed to be swift, decisive. The stable air, thick with the scent of hay and horseflesh, offered a fleeting moment of peace. Midnight, her father's mare, nickered softly as Madeline approached. The mare was old, her coat dulled by time, but her spirit was still strong. "Just us, girl," Madeline whispered, burying her face in the mare's mane. "Just us now." She secured the satchel to the saddle, the meager weight a stark reminder of her solitude. The moon, a sliver of silver against the inky sky, offered little illumination as she led Midnight out of the barn, carefully avoiding the creaking floorboards. Each shadow seemed to lengthen, to twist into the leering face of Silas Thorne, his cruel smile promising a future worse than death. The journey was a blur of aching muscles and rising fear. The familiar road quickly gave way to dusty tracks, then to the unforgiving wilderness that stretched towards the Dawson Ranch. The air, cool and crisp at first, grew heavy with the pre-dawn chill. Madeline pulled her shawl tighter, but it did little to ward off the cold dread that seeped into her bones. Every rustle in the brush, every distant howl sent a jolt of terror through her. She imagined Thorne's men, already dispatched, their faces grim, their purpose clear. She spurred Midnight onward, her own strength waning, her resolve fueled only by the sheer terror of what awaited her if she faltered. Hours blurred into a punishing eternity. The sun, a brutal orange orb, began its slow ascent, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters in the early light. Her throat was parched, her eyes gritty from the dust and lack of sleep. Her legs, unaccustomed to such prolonged riding, screamed in protest. Yet she pushed on, her gaze fixed on the distant outline of the hills, knowing that Rhett Dawson's ranch lay nestled somewhere within their embrace. The memory of his dismissive words, his cold assessment of her as nothing more than a calculating fortune hunter, stung anew. He had seen only her family's fading wealth, not the woman beneath the polite facade. He would likely turn her away, confirm his low opinion of her, and leave her to her fate. But where else was there to go? Thorne's reach was long, and her family home was now a cage. Rhett, for all his harsh judgments, was a man of his word, and despite everything, a man of honor. He might not believe her, but he wouldn't turn her over to Thorne, she hoped. Finally, as the sun climbed higher, beating down with merciless intensity, the familiar sight of the Dawson ranch house appeared in the distance. A cluster of buildings, stark and unyielding against the vast expanse of the land. Relief, potent and overwhelming, surged through her. quickly followed by a fresh wave of trepidation. What would she say? How could she explain? Her mind, exhausted and frayed, struggled to form coherent thoughts. She dismounted near the weathered porch, her legs threatening to give way. Midnight, flanks heaving, nudged her gently. The silence of the ranch was unnerving, broken only by the chirping of cicadas and the distant lowing of cattle. Madeline's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and desperation. Her dress was caked with dust, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with grime and dried tears. She looked a fright, a beggar at the door of the man who had once scorned her. Raising a trembling hand, she knocked, the sound echoing hollowly in the morning air. Her knuckles, raw and sore, barely made a sound. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time, a plea more than a summons. Still nothing. A cold dread seeped into her. Was he even here? Had she ridden all this way, risked everything, only to find an empty house? Just as despair threatened to consume her, the heavy oak door creaked open, revealing the shadowed interior. An unexpected plea. The door gave a protesting groan as it swung inward, revealing not the empty dark Madeline anticipated, but the imposing figure of Rhett Dawson. He stood, a formidable silhouette, against the faint glow of a lone lantern. His eyes, deep as a moonless sky, narrowed in stark disbelief. Dust powdered her gown, damp strands of hair clung to her forehead, and the raw terror etched on her face was an undeniable testament to her desperate straits. Madeline? His voice, typically a low baritone, cracked with surprise, a blend of question and accusation. He remained unmoving in the doorway, blocking her entrance, arms crossed over his formidable chest. The scent of wood smoke and saddle leather, familiar and oddly comforting, momentarily quieted her trembling. "Rhett, please," she rasped, her voice a ragged whisper. A cold, unwelcome tear carved a path through the grime on her cheek. I need your help." His gaze swept over her, taking in the travel-stained remains of her once fine dress, the frantic tremor in her hands, the almost feral light in her eyes. The scorn he'd always harbored for her, his conviction that she was a delicate creature seeking only luxury and status, flickered. This was not the Madeline Shaw he knew, the woman who carried her head high despite her family's dwindling fortunes. This was a cornered animal, gasping for air. "My help?" he scoffed, though the usual bite in his tone was softened by a nuance she couldn't quite place. "What could a woman like you possibly need from me, Miss Shaw, that your father's grand schemes can't provide?" The words stung, a familiar ache, yet the urgency of her situation dwarfed the pain. "My father, he sold me, Rhett, to Mr. Thorne, to clear his debts." The confession tore from her, raw and humiliating. She searched his face for any flicker of understanding, anything beyond his customary mockery. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a muscle in his jaw tightening. The name Thorne hung in the air, a heavy, unpleasant weight. Mr. Thorne was notorious, not just for his wealth, but for his cold, calculating cruelty, his inclination to acquire whatever he desired without compunction. "Sold you," he repeated, the words slow, deliberate, as if testing their reality. Like chattel? She nodded, a lump in her throat preventing speech. Her gaze dropped to the worn planks of his porch, unable to meet his intense stare. He arranged it. He said it was the only way. I overheard them. Thorn was coming for me tonight. I had to leave. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated by a distant owl's hoot and Midnight's nervous snort from the hitching post. Rhett remained motionless, a figure carved from granite, his expression unreadable. He had always dismissed her as calculating, an opportunist, a woman who would marry for gain. Yet the abject terror in her eyes, the genuine despair radiating from her very being, chipped away at that rigid conviction. This was no performance. This was a woman running for her life. Finally, he stepped aside, his voice gruff. "Come in. You look ready to collapse." Relief, potent and dizzying, washed over her. She stumbled past him. The warmth of the small living room was a stark counterpoint to the cold night. Rhett closed the door, plunging the room into deeper shadow before he turned up the lamp on a nearby table, bathing the space in a warm, golden glow. "Now," he said, his voice softer, though still laced with a weary authority. "Tell me everything. Don't omit a single detail." Madeline sank onto a worn armchair, the velvet surprisingly soft beneath her fingers. She recounted the evening's events, her voice gaining strength as the words poured out, painting a vivid picture of her father's desperation, Thorn's chilling demands, and her frantic escape. She spoke of the fear, the isolation, the sheer desperation that had driven her to his door, fully aware he was her last, unthinkable resort. Rhett listened, his gaze fixed on her face. He observed the subtle tremors that still ran through her, the way her hands clasped and unclasped in her lap, the raw emotion flickering in her eyes. His initial cynicism began to crumble, replaced by a growing disquiet. Thorn was a dangerous man, with deep-reaching connections. To harbor Madeline would be to invite trouble, to draw Thorn's malevolent attention directly to his ranch, to risk everything he had built, his land, his reputation, perhaps even his life. He walked to the hearth, poking at the dying embers of a fire, his back to her. The silence stretched again, thick with unspoken questions and weighty implications. Madeline watched his broad shoulders, the tension in his stance, knowing her fate hung precariously. Would he turn her away, send her back into Thorn's clutches, or worse, onto the desolate road where her options were non-existent? Finally he turned, his expression grim. "You understand what you're asking, Madeline?" His voice was low, serious. "You're asking me to defy Thorn. He won't let this go. He'll come looking for you and for anyone who helps you." Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. "I understand, Rhett, but I have nowhere else to go. You are my only hope." He studied her, a long, searching look that seemed to pierce her very soul. The woman before him, vulnerable and desperate, was a far cry from the haughty Miss Shaw he'd once dismissed. A slow, almost imperceptible shift occurred within him. A grudging respect, a dawning realization that perhaps he had misjudged her and himself all along. The weight of her plea settled heavily on his shoulders, a challenge to his conscience, a test of the honor he claimed to uphold. A temporary sanctuary. The silence in Rhett's study was a palpable weight, heavy with unspoken accusations and the chilling reality of Madeline's precarious situation. He raked a hand through his dark hair, the familiar rasp of stubble against his palm a small anchor amidst the internal tempest. "There's a small line shack on the far side of the property," he eventually stated, his voice a gravelly monotone, stripped of all warmth. "It has a cot, a stove. You can stay there for now." Madeline's shoulders, which had been hunched with tension, eased imperceptibly. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still rough from recent tears. "I won't be any trouble." Rhett scoffed, a dry, cynical sound. "That remains to be seen." Snatching a lantern from its hook by the door, its glass chimney dulled by dust, he gestured. "Come on." The walk to the cabin was brief, the air crisp and cold, carrying the sharp scent of pine and damp earth. Moonlight dappled through the sparse trees, painting long, fluid shadows that seemed to mock the fragile tendril of hope unfurling in Madeline's chest. The cabin itself was diminutive, barely 2 rooms, tucked away at the edge of a small clearing. It appeared an afterthought, a transient dwelling for a lone ranch hand, not a haven for a woman fleeing peril. Inside, the air was stale, imbued with the scent of aged timber and long disuse. Rhett ignited the lantern, its soft glow illuminating a stark interior. A narrow cot draped with a thin, faded quilt, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a small wood-burning stove in the corner. "There's kindling in the box outside, water barrels by the porch. I'll send some provisions in the morning." He paused at the doorway, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering on the tear tracks marring her cheeks, the slight tremor in her hands. "Don't stray from the property. And don't speak to anyone should visitors arrive." With that, he departed, the cabin door clicking shut with a soft finality that echoed his leaving. Madeline sank onto the cot, the thin mattress offering scant solace. She was safe for the moment, but the isolation was profound, the silence absolute. Yet a spark of defiance ignited within her. She was a survivor, not merely a victim. The next morning, the sun ascended, painting the horizon in hues of rose and liquid gold. Madeline, after a fitful night, discovered a fresh bucket of water and a basket of rations, stale bread, dried meat, and a pair of apples, awaiting her on the porch. She ate sparingly, then set about making the cabin more livable. She swept the floor, scrubbed the small window until it gleamed, and even managed to coax a fire from the stove, banishing the pervasive chill. Later that day, propelled by a need for purpose, she ventured outside. She found a stack of split logs near the main ranch house and, despite her inexperience, began to stack them neatly, her hands quickly growing sore and grimy. She worked with quiet determination, her mind a maelstrom of fear and a burgeoning resolve. Rhett, observing from the shadowed porch of his own dwelling, nursed a mug of lukewarm coffee. He had anticipated her cowering, her complaints about the primitive conditions. Instead, she was laboring. Her movements were a touch awkward, her petite frame clearly unaccustomed to such exertion, but there was a quiet tenacity in the way she lifted each log, regardless of its weight. He watched her brush a stray strand of hair from her face with the back of a smudged hand. A smudge undeniably absent yesterday when she arrived in her fine, albeit rumpled, dress. Over the ensuing days, Madeline continued to confound him. She didn't complain. She didn't demand. She simply acted. She assisted Martha, the elderly cook, shelling peas and kneading dough, her occasional laughter drifting across the yard, light and unexpected. She mended a tear in a canvas tarp, her stitches surprisingly neat. She even spent an afternoon meticulously oiling the worn leather of a saddle, her brow furrowed in concentration. Rhett found himself observing her more often than he cared to admit. He'd catch fleeting glimpses from his study window, or while returning from the fields. He saw her kneeling by the creek, washing clothes on a washboard, her slender arms moving rhythmically. He saw her sharing a quiet moment with one of the ranch hand's children, sketching a bird on a piece of slate with a soft smile. She was not the spoiled, self-absorbed woman he had so readily dismissed. There was a resilience there, a quiet strength that chipped away at his carefully constructed defenses, like water eroding stone. One afternoon, he discovered her on her cabin porch, a small stray kitten curled contentedly in her lap. She stroked its soft fur, her expression gentle, almost wistful. When she looked up and saw him, her smile receded slightly, replaced by a guarded neutrality. "You're still here," he stated, the words emerging harsher than intended. "Where else would I go?" she countered, her voice soft but firm. "Mr. Thorne won't relent, and I have nowhere else." Rhett felt a familiar flicker of irritation, swiftly followed by an unfamiliar pang of something akin to guilt. He had intended for her to be a mere inconvenience, a temporary burden he could disregard. But Madeline Shaw, in her quiet defiance and unexpected resilience, was proving to be anything but. She was a presence, a complication, a stark reminder that some dangers could not be outrun, and some prejudices deserved re-examination. The temporary sanctuary he'd grudgingly offered was slowly becoming something more intricate, something potentially perilous for them both. Shared shadows and growing bonds. The weeks bled into each other, marked less by the calendar and more by the gradual softening of the cabin's edges, both inside and out. Dust motes danced in the sparse sunlight that speared through the single window, illuminating Madeline as she meticulously mended a tear in her simple calico dress. The silence that once felt oppressive now held a comfortable weight, punctuated only by the crackle of the small fire and the distant lowing of cattle. One blustery afternoon, as the wind howled like a banshee around the small structure, Rhett found himself watching her. She wasn't aware of his gaze, her brow furrowed in concentration as she stitched. "You're good with your hands," he observed, the words sounding foreign even to his own ears. Madeline looked up, startled, a needle suspended midair. "I had to be," she replied, her voice quiet. "After Papa lost the mill, there wasn't much left. Mama taught me what she could. We were always trying to make do." She hesitated, then continued, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "There were times, after the last drought, when we went without. Sometimes a whole week would pass with nothing but watered-down gruel. I learned to stretch a thread, to turn a worn cloth into something useful." Rhett grunted, a non-committal sound that nevertheless encouraged her. "It wasn't always like that, though," she continued, her gaze distant, fixed on some memory beyond the cabin walls. "When I was a little girl, the Shaw estate was vibrant. Papa would hold grand balls. Mama would fill the house with music and flowers. I remember the scent of jasmine trailing from the conservatory and the laughter of guests echoing through the halls. It was a world away from This. She gestured vaguely at her surroundings, but without a hint of complaint. I wanted to bring it back, to make it all right again for them. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. That's why I was willing to marry anyone who could help. Rhett's jaw tightened. He knew that anyone was a barb aimed at him, a reminder of his initial dismissal, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he found himself saying, "It's a hard thing watching everything you know crumble." He hadn't meant to speak, but the words were out, echoing in the confined space. He cleared his throat, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest. My ma, she was a force of nature, always humming, always planting. She made this place feel like home. He paused, picking at a loose thread on his trousers. She died when I was 16. Fell ill during a harsh winter. Pa, he never recovered. Just withered away like a plant starved of water. Left me to pick up the pieces, keep this ranch alive. Madeline's needle lay still on her lap. Her eyes, usually guarded, held a genuine sympathy that surprised him. That's a heavy burden for a boy, she said softly. It was, Red admitted, the word a raw exhalation. He rarely spoke of it, not to anyone. The loneliness had become a part of him, a constant companion. Felt like I was fighting the world all by myself. Still do sometimes. The wind outside picked up, rattling the window pane. Madeline rose, walked to the small table, and poured 2 cups of weak coffee, adding a generous dollop of the precious condensed milk to each. She handed one to Rhett, their fingers brushing for a fleeting moment. A spark, not of friction, but of something else entirely, passed between them. You're not alone now, she said, her voice barely audible above the wind, her gaze steady, direct. It wasn't a promise, or even a statement of affection. It was simply a fact, spoken with a quiet conviction that resonated deep within him. In the shared warmth of the cabin, surrounded by the shadows cast by the flickering firelight, the walls around Rhett Dawson, built meticulously over 2 decades, seemed to shift, ever so slightly. A nascent trust, fragile yet potent, began to take root. Silas's shadow looms. The clatter of hooves on the hard-pan earth, a sound too numerous for friendly callers, ripped through the afternoon quiet. Rhett, who'd been mending a bridle in the barn, straightened, his jaw tightening. Madeline, startled, dropped the book she'd been reading on the porch swing. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She recognized the dark, imposing figures even before they drew closer. Silas. 3 men, hard-eyed and smelling of stale whiskey and unwashed leather, reined in their horses before the ranch house. Their leader, a broad-shouldered brute with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, dismounted with a heavy thud. He surveyed the ranch with an insolent gaze that lingered on Madeline. "Rhett Dawson?" the man grunted, his voice a gravelly rasp. Rhett stepped out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. His eyes, usually shadowed, held a dangerous glint. "That's me. You got business here?" The man sneered. "Mr. Thorne sends his regards. He also sends a message. The little bird you're harboring belongs to him. He'd be much obliged if you returned her, unharmed, by sundown tomorrow. Or there'll be consequences." His gaze flickered to Madeline, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Very unpleasant consequences for everyone involved. Madeline instinctively recoiled, her hand flying to her throat. The air crackled with unspoken threats. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones, remembering Silas's heavy hands, his calculating eyes. She had brought this danger to Rhett's door, just as she had feared. Rhett took a slow, deliberate step forward, planting his feet wide apart. The movement was subtle, but it radiated an unyielding resolve. Madeline Shaw is not a bird, nor is she anyone's property, he stated, his voice low but cutting through the tension like a finely honed blade. She's a guest here, and she's staying. The scar-faced man let out a harsh laugh, echoed by his companions. You think you can defy Silas Thorne, rancher? He owns judges, owns sheriffs. He owns everything within 50 miles, and soon he'll own everything beyond it, too. Don't be a fool. Hand her over and walk away clean. I think, Rhett countered, his voice gaining an edge of steel, that Silas Thorne has bitten off more than he can chew. He moved with surprising speed, stepping directly in front of Madeline, shielding her with his body. The message was clear, unmistakable. Madeline watched him, a knot of conflicting emotions tightening in her chest. Fear, yes, but also a burgeoning sense of something she hadn't expected. A profound relief, a fragile hope. He wasn't sending her away. He was standing his ground. For her. The scar-faced man's expression hardened. He took a step towards Rhett, his hand hovering near the pistol at his hip. You're making a grave mistake, Dawson. Silas doesn't tolerate defiance. He'll burn this place to the ground and you with it before he lets anyone cross him. Rhett's gaze was unwavering, meeting the threat head on. Then tell Silas Thorne that he'll have to come burn it himself. And when he does, he'll find me waiting. A tense silence descended, broken only by the snorting of the horses. The wind, which had been a gentle whisper, seemed to hold its breath. The scar-faced man stared at Rhett for a long moment, assessing, measuring. Finally, with a frustrated snarl, he turned and remounted his horse. You'll regret this, Dawson, he spat, glaring at Rhett before wheeling his horse around. The other two men followed, their horses churning up dust as they galloped away, leaving behind an ominous silence. Madeline felt her knees weaken, and she gripped the porch post for support. The adrenaline coursing through her veins left her trembling. She looked at Rhett, whose back was still to her, his shoulders rigid with suppressed fury. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. The anger was still there, but beneath it she saw something else, a fierce protectiveness that stole her breath. He hadn't flinched. He hadn't hesitated. Are you all right? He asked, his voice rougher than usual. She nodded, unable to speak, a lump forming in her throat. The reality of his defiance, of the danger he had just invited upon himself for her, settled heavily in her mind. His words, "She's staying," resonated with a power she hadn't expected. They'll be back, she finally managed to whisper, her voice thin. Silas won't give up. Rhett's jaw clenched. I know, he said, his gaze sweeping over the familiar landscape of his ranch, the place his family had toiled for generations. His home. He had spent years isolating himself, guarding his heart, but in that moment, standing before Silas's men, a truth had crystallized within him. The thought of Madeline being dragged back to that man, to that life, ignited a fury he hadn't known he possessed. He wouldn't allow it. Not anymore. He wouldn't let her go. Madeline watched him, seeing not just the defiant rancher, but the man beneath. The man who had shared his pain with her, and who now, without question, was willing to face down a powerful enemy for her. A profound shift occurred within her, a silent recognition of his true character, starkly different from the proud, dismissive man she had first encountered. The fragile trust between them had just taken a monumental leap. Preparing for the storm. A pre-dawn chill, mirroring the dread within their hearts, gripped the ranch. The sun had barely kissed the eastern hills when a lone rider, coated in dust and gasping for air, thundered into the yard. It was Jeb, one of Rhett's men, dispatched to scout the Thorne estate. His face was ghastly pale, his eyes wide with an urgent terror. "Mr. Dawson," he wheezed, still astride his lathered horse. "Thorne, he's raising an army. At least 20 armed men rode in. More are surely coming. They're threatening to raze this place and take the woman by force." Rhett's jaw tightened, a hard knot throbbing under his tanned skin. He'd anticipated Silas's retaliation, but not such raw aggression, such brazen disregard for law or life. On the porch, Madeline clutched the wooden railing until her knuckles blanched. The very air seemed to thicken, heavy with the oppressive weight of the coming storm. "All right, Jeb," Rhett's voice cut through the tension, low but resolute. "Water yourself, then lend a hand. We're short on time." He turned to Madeline, his gaze sweeping over her with a newfound respect, stripped of his former skepticism. "You heard him. Silas isn't playing games. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about everything we have." Madeline met his gaze, her own eyes alight with quiet determination. "I understand. What do we do?" A plan already coalescing in his mind, Rhett nodded. "We fortify. Every door, every window. We dig in. This ranch is built sturdy, but it needs shoring up." He gestured to the sprawling landscape. "And we need eyes. High ground, south and west. That's where they'll come from, I reckon." The ranch hands, a tight-knit crew who'd weathered many squalls but none quite like this, moved with renewed purpose. Rhett barked orders, his voice carrying an undeniable authority, and the men responded without hesitation. They hauled heavy timbers to barricade ground-floor windows, reinforced the thick oak doors with crossbeams, and began clearing fields of fire. Madeline didn't stand idle. She seized an axe and started splitting logs for firewood, her motions surprisingly efficient despite her delicate frame. Her hands, once accustomed to finer work, quickly blistered, but she ignored the sting. When Rhett passed, he paused, watching her. "You don't have to do that, Madeline," he said, his voice unexpectedly gentle. "There are other tasks." She looked up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek, stray wisps of hair escaping her pins. "I'm not a liability, Rhett. I can contribute. This is my fight, too." She gestured with the axe. "Besides, if they burn the place, we'll still need fire for cooking, won't we?" A faint, weary smile touched her lips. Rhett found himself returning it, a genuine, unburdening curve of his mouth. "All right, then. Just be careful. No sense getting hurt before they even arrive." He continued on, but the sight of her, resolute and capable, sparked something akin to pride within him. Later, as the sun dipped low, casting long, fractured shadows across the yard, Madeline joined Rhett and his foreman, Ben, at the well. They were discussing the strategic placement of their limited rifles and ammunition. "The stables," Ben was saying, "they're too exposed. We can't defend them without stretching our men too thin." No, Rhett agreed, rubbing his chin. We'll bring the horses into the corrals nearest the house. If it comes to it, we retreat inside, make our stand there. It's solid stone. Madeline spoke up, her voice clear and strong. What about the old root cellar? It's deep and the entrance is small. We could store extra water and food down there, perhaps even a medical kit. A place to retreat if the house is breached or for the wounded. Rhett and Ben exchanged a look. That's not a bad idea, Miss Shaw, Ben said, a hint of surprise in his tone. Rhett nodded slowly. It's a good idea, Madeline. Ben, get some of the boys on it. Reinforce the hatch, clear out anything unnecessary. She felt a flicker of satisfaction, knowing she wasn't merely a burden, but an active participant. As evening deepened, the air grew thick with the scent of pine and sweat, punctuated by the rhythmic clatter of hammers on wood. They toiled late into the night by the flickering glow of lanterns. Madeline helped Rhett carry heavy barrels of water into the house, her small frame straining but never faltering. She listened to his terse instructions, followed them diligently, and occasionally offered insights of her own, which he increasingly considered. The shift in their dynamic was palpable. The initial animosity, the ingrained suspicion, had been stripped away by the raw immediacy of their shared predicament. Now a quiet understanding had settled between them, a rhythm to their cooperation. He barked orders, she complied. She offered an observation, he considered it. They were no longer two individuals at odds, but two parts of a single, desperate defense. As the moon climbed high, casting an ethereal glow over the fortified ranch, Rhett paused, leaning against the newly reinforced window. He gazed out at the silent, expectant landscape, then turned to Madeline, who meticulously arranged a stack of fresh bandages on the kitchen table. Tomorrow, he said, his voice barely a whisper. They'll be here. Madeline looked up, her face smudged, hair tangled, but her eyes held a fierce light. Then we'll be ready. He saw not just courage, but a deep, unwavering resolve. It was a beautiful, terrifying thing to behold. And in that moment, under the quiet vigilance of the moon, Rhett knew, with absolute certainty, that he wouldn't face this storm alone. The battle for the ranch and love. The first shots splintered the pre-dawn silence, ripping through the thin air like angry wasps. Silas Thorne hadn't waited for full light, a testament to his impatience and disdain for tactics. Dust, kicked up by the thunder of hooves, swirled around the ranch house, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder. Rhett, a shotgun cradled in his arms, stood firm at the main parlor window, his gaze sweeping the chaos beyond. Figures on horseback, dark and menacing, streamed across the open range, their shouts a primal roar. "They're coming around the west fence!" Madeline's voice, surprisingly steady, cut through the din. She was at the adjacent window, a rifle clutched tightly, her eyes narrowed with a fierce resolve Rhett hadn't fully appreciated until now. Her usually pale cheeks were flushed, her breathing shallow, but her aim, he noted, as she squeezed off a shot that sent one of Thorne's riders tumbling, was remarkably true. "Hold your fire until they're closer," Rhett commanded, his own shots methodical, each one finding its mark. The initial rush faltered as a few of Thorne's men fell, their momentum broken by the unexpected accuracy of the ranch's defenders. Rhett moved with a predatory grace, reloading his shotgun, then switching to a repeater, his movements fluid and efficient. He caught a glimpse of Thorne himself, a black silhouette astride a powerful stallion, directing his men with sweeping gestures, his face contorted in a sneer that promised retribution. A hail of bullets peppered the house, splinters of wood flying as the walls absorbed the impact. Madeline ducked instinctively, then straightened, her jaw set. "They're trying to flank us," she yelled, pointing to a group attempting to scale the low stone wall near the stables. "Jesse, keep them pinned!" Rhett roared to one of his ranch hands stationed at the corner of the house. He leaped over a fallen chair, grabbing a fresh box of ammunition. As he moved, a bullet grazed his arm, a searing fire that he barely acknowledged. He felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him, not just for his home, but for the woman fighting beside him, her courage a beacon in the storm. The air grew thick with smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The fight became a brutal ballet of advance and retreat, punctuated by the sharp crack of gunfire and the guttural cries of men. Madeline, abandoning her position, darted to his side as he reloaded, handing him a pre-filled cartridge belt. Their hands brushed, a brief, charged contact amidst the violence. "He wants you, Rhett," she said, her voice low and intense. "He wants to make an example of you." "Let him try," Rhett growled, his eyes fixed on Thorne, who was now dismounting, his face contorted in a mask of rage. Thorne was bigger than Rhett, a brute of a man, and he stalked towards the house, his men providing covering fire. This wasn't just about Madeline anymore. It was about pride, about territory, about two men who represented opposing worlds. "Stay back, Madeline," Rhett ordered, stepping out from the relative cover of the doorway, his rifle leveled. "Not a chance," she retorted, positioning herself just behind him, her own rifle ready. "This is my fight, too." Thorne stopped a few yards from the house, his eyes burning with a chilling malice. "Dawson, surrender the woman and this can end." His voice boomed, thick with menace. "She's not yours to take, Thorne," Rhett shouted back, his own voice laced with steel. "And this ranch isn't yours to burn." Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Fool, you truly believe you can stand against me?" He drew a massive bowie knife, its blade glinting wickedly in the faint light. "I'll gut you and take her anyway." The air crackled with anticipation. Rhett knew this was it. He wouldn't let Thorne have his way, not with Madeline, not with his land. He met Thorne's furious charge head-on, his rifle butt swinging in a brutal arc. The impact sent a shockwave up his arm, but Thorne, surprisingly agile, ducked the blow and came in low, the knife a blur. Rhett sidestepped, feeling the wind of the blade pass inches from his ribs. This wasn't a gentleman's duel. It was a brawl, raw and desperate. They grappled, rolling in the dust, exchanging blows. Rhett's fist connected with Thorne's jaw, a satisfying crunch. Thorne retaliated with a vicious kick that sent Rhett sprawling. As Thorne lunged again, knife raised for a killing blow, a shot rang out. Thorne faltered, a surprised grunt escaping his lips, and a dark stain bloomed on his shoulder. He looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, to see Madeline, rifle still smoking, standing firm. The distraction was all Rhett needed. He sprang to his feet, grabbing Thorne's wrist, twisting the knife from his grasp. Thorne roared in pain, momentarily disarmed. Rhett's next move was swift and decisive, a powerful punch that sent Thorne staggering backward, collapsing into the dirt, defeated. The fight drained from Thorne's men as their leader fell, their assault dissolving into a panicked retreat. Rhett stood over Thorne, breathing heavily, his knuckles aching. He looked at Madeline, her face smudged with dirt and powder, but her eyes bright with a fierce triumph. In that moment, surrounded by the remnants of the battle, he saw not just a woman he was protecting, but a partner, a survivor, a force to be reckoned with. The fight was over, but something profound had just begun. A public declaration and a new beginning. The dust settled, thick and cloying, a testament to the brutal dance that had just concluded. Silas Thorne lay defeated, his men scattered like chaff in a windstorm. Rhett, bruised and bleeding but undeniably victorious, stood over him, the very air around him vibrating with raw power. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of his ranch hands, the few townsfolk who had ridden out, and finally settling on Madeline. She stood amidst the chaos, her hair disheveled, a streak of grime across her cheek, but her eyes blazed with a fierce light that had only grown brighter throughout the battle. A rifle was still clutched in her hand, a symbol of the unexpected strength she had unveiled. The sight of her, unwavering and defiant, sent a jolt through Rhett, a profound recognition that transcended the exhaustion and adrenaline. He strode towards her, the ground crunching under his boots. Every eye followed him, the silence profound. Madeline met his gaze, a question forming in her eyes, a fragile hope mixed with the lingering terror of the morning. When he reached her, he didn't hesitate. He pulled the rifle from her grasp, setting it gently aside, then reached out, drawing her into a fierce, possessive embrace. Her body stiffened for a moment, surprised, then melted against him. The scent of gunpowder and sweat clung to them both, but beneath it, Rhett inhaled the familiar, comforting scent of her, a scent that had, without his conscious permission, become home. He felt the rapid beat of her heart against his chest, mirroring his own. "She is my wife." Rhett's voice, rough with emotion and the lingering strain of battle, cut through the stillness. His words were not a question, nor a plea, but a declaration, clear and unyielding. "And anyone who dares to challenge that, or to threaten her, will answer to me." He looked over her shoulder, his eyes sweeping across the assembled men, a silent challenge in their depths. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but it was quickly silenced by the force of Rhett's presence. The men who had fought alongside him, witnessing Madeline's courage and skill, understood. They had seen her protect him, had seen her stand shoulder to shoulder with them against Thorne's brutality. This was no arranged marriage of convenience. This was a partnership forged in fire. Madeline pulled back slightly, her face upturned to his, her eyes glistening. "Rhett." Her voice was a whisper, a breath of disbelief and burgeoning joy. He leaned down, pressing a rough, tender kiss to her lips. It was a kiss of triumph, of relief, of a future irrevocably altered. It tasted of dust and defiance, of a love hard won and deeply cherished. When he pulled away, he kept his arm securely around her waist, a tangible connection, a public display of ownership and devotion. "From this day forward, Madeline Dawson," he continued, his voice softer now, meant only for her, "you are mine, and I, yours." He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb, marveling at the strength he found there. No more running, no more fear, just us. A slow, collective sigh seemed to pass through the onlookers. The tension that had held them captive for hours finally began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of peace, of rightness. They had seen the truth unfold before their eyes. A man who had once scorned a woman, now standing beside her, declaring his unwavering commitment. Later, as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the recovering ranch, Rhett and Madeline walked hand in hand through the property. The ranch hands were already beginning the arduous task of repair, their movements imbued with a renewed purpose. The air still carried a faint tang of smoke, but it was mingled with the scent of fresh earth and the promise of a new day. Madeline's earlier fear had receded, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging she hadn't known was possible. She glanced at Rhett, his profile etched against the vivid blue sky. He was still a man of few words, his emotions often guarded. But the events of the morning had peeled back layers, revealing a heart that beat fiercely for justice, and now, for her. "It won't be easy, you know," Rhett said, breaking the comfortable silence. His gaze swept over the damaged fences, the scarred earth. "Rebuilding will take time, and Thorne, he's not one to forget." Madeline squeezed his hand. "We'll face it together." Her voice was steady, resolute. "We faced him together. We can face anything." He looked down at her then, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It wasn't the cynical smirk she had first encountered, but a genuine expression, tinged with admiration and a quiet tenderness. "Yes," he agreed, his thumb caressing the back of her hand. "Together." They stopped by the corral, watching a ranch hand try to coax a skittish horse into a new enclosure. The scene was mundane, ordinary, yet for them it felt charged with profound significance. This was their life now, built on the foundations of a forced proximity that had blossomed into something real, something enduring. Rhett turned fully to her, his grip tightening on her hand. "I was a fool," he admitted, his voice low, raw with belated understanding. "I judged you without knowing you. I let my pride blind me." Madeline reached up, her fingers tracing the faint bruise on his cheekbone. "And I judged you too," she confessed, her voice equally soft. "I thought you incapable of seeing beyond your own pain. We were both wrong." He pulled her closer, his arms encircling her waist once more. The warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek, was a symphony of belonging. "We start anew," Rhett murmured, his lips brushing against her hair. "A real marriage, built on trust and everything else we've found." Madeline leaned into him, her heart overflowing. The ranch, once a refuge, was now home. The man she had once viewed with disdain now held her future in his hands, and she in his. The sun warmed their faces, a benevolent promise of the future. The fight was over, but their story, their true story, had only just begun. Together they looked out at the sprawling land, a canvas upon which they would paint their new beginning, a testament to a love forged in the crucible of fire and fortified by an unbreakable bond.